This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This year is the 100th birthday of the Federal Reserve Board. What does it do? What has it done? Is it still necessary? Former Fed official Stephen Axilrod explains it all. Any large political coalition is always going to be hard to hold together, and that presents problems for Democratic congressional and presidential candidates in 2014 and 2016. Harvard political scientist Ryan Enos explores potential backlash to the Obama electoral coalition. And Bill Press speaks with Virginia Congressman Bobby Scott about the perils of privacy invasion. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Economist Stephen Axilrod is now an international monetary consultant, but before that he spent more than 30 years as a top official of the Federal Reserve Board. He says the Fed may have had some responsibility for the 2008 fiscal crisis, but also played a crucial role in preventing a full-scale meltdown. And joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Stephen Axilrod is the former staff director and secretary of the Federal Open Market Committee of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. He worked at the Fed for 34 years and has since 1986 worked in private markets and as a consultant on monetary policy with other countries. He is also the author of a new book, The Federal Reserve, What Everyone Needs to Know. Stephen Axilrod, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, Bill, delighted to be with you.
So the Federal Reserve System is something obviously everybody's learned about, at least for a few minutes even in high school or college, but really very few people seem to understand how it works. So if you would please, tell us about the primary functions of what is, in effect, America's central bank.
Well, it's in the modern world, its main function, apart from the recent unpleasant credit crisis, its main function is to control inflation. Central bank, the U.S. Central Bank, was set up originally 100 years ago in 1913 to be sure there was a backup to try to avert crises in the banking system, liquidity crises, crises of confidence. But it has changed over time as its powers were better understood to become its principal monetary policy purpose is to control inflation. In the process of controlling inflation, it doesn't merely look at that, but by law, its object is to have policies consistent with maximum employment and acceptable interest rates in that process. So it really has several economic objectives. In addition, it has many regulatory powers that affect the banking system. So it attempts to do its part for assuring a safe and sound banking system. But it is not the only institution in the country that has powers to regulate the banking system. There's the controller of the currency, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and state agencies. So it's not unique in that respect, but it is unique in its capacity to control inflation and look to maximum employment while doing so.
And, as you mentioned, this is the 100th birthday of the Fed. Is it still as crucial to the economy as it was when it was created to forestall financial panics?
Oh, I think more crucial because when it was originally created, it wasn't thought of controlling inflation. It was not part of the thinking process that developed in the Congress that developed into the Federal Reserve Act. So now it has a much more crucial and more modern role. But for the purpose of forestalling crises, it is very, very crucial, as was demonstrated in the recent credit crisis, because it was the Fed's actions. It wasn't exactly it was a little bit guilty in the emergence of the crisis, but its actions in the heart of the crisis were crucial to keeping the crisis from developing into a full-fledged breakdown. That is, through the magic of central banking, as it were, it could create all the credit needed to keep the crisis from just developing into something that we really wouldn't have wanted to live through. Living through what we had wasn't so good, but we definitely wouldn't have wanted to live through anything considerably worse. And the Fed's ability to expand its balance sheet, that is to lend another couple of $1 trillion inside of about 3 months, kept the crisis within bounds. I was going to say reasonable bounds, but none of these bounds are reasonable that we've been living with.
No, certainly not. We're speaking with Stephen Axilrod, a 34-year veteran of the Federal Reserve System. He's also the author of a new book, The Federal Reserve, What Everyone Needs to Know. If it is so crucial, why is the Fed independent of the rest of the government? And quite frankly, how independent is it really?
Well, that's a very good question. And since the book answers questions, the format of the book is to ask questions and answer them within a structure. That's one question that very much occurred to me, and my experience, of course, was in what's called an independent central bank, the Federal Reserve. I think that it was set up in 1913 with a certain degree of independence, that it could make decisions independent of the executive branch of the government. The Fed is not independent of the government. It's independent by law of the executive branch. And it can make decisions on monetary policy without checking them with the President or the Secretary of the Treasury. And it makes certain regulatory decisions, of course, on its own. But again, that is the area where it's not all that independent because of all the competing regulatory agencies. Well, competing isn't quite the word, but like the controller of the currency is a regulatory agency, somewhat independent within the Treasury, which charters national banks and therefore has to help regulate national banks. And so but the Fed is independent in the modern world in monetary policy. That is, Congress has given it goals, and the stated goals are price stability, maximum employment, and reasonable interest rates or low interest rates. But the interest rate thing is the product of everything else, really. So that's its crucial independence, but it's independent in that sense within the government. That is, the Congress is a very important and crucial branch of our government, and the Fed is the creature of the Congress, and it can be changed by the Congress, but although the president has veto powers and all that, of course.
Sure. Now, as you mentioned the founding goals of the Fed, stabilizing prices, interest rates, employment, is there the potential for some conflict with one another there?
Oh, yes, but the long-run goal, the Fed is uniquely adapted to is price stability, because the old saw that too much money chasing too few goods gives you inflation, is the money part is what the Fed can create. In the modern world, we're not money. Money resides in various assets all over the place, and not just in demand deposits. You have assets in a money market fund, and that can be you can spend those very easily, and in stock funds even, although you have to take the risk of selling your stock, and then you convert that to money and you use it. But the Fed essentially can control what goes on there by its power to expand its assets at will or contract them at will. So the Fed has that unique power, but it also has the power to raise and lower the interest rates it controls, which is whatever interest rate it decides it wants to control, and the one that's most usual is a money market interest rate, which in our country is called a federal funds rate, which is the rate on overnight money loaned among banks. But the Fed can control that and raise and lower it in an effort to make it easier credit to get us out of a recession or tighter credit to keep us from going into an inflationary situation. And so it has those controls, which are its own. As I said before, it doesn't have to check its decisions in that respect with anyone in the government.
Sure. We're speaking with Stephen Axilrod, author of a new book, The Federal Reserve, What Everyone Needs to Know. How much is the Fed responsible for the financial crisis of 2008, from which some of us are still recovering?
Well, on the regulatory front, thinking of the Fed with its two main functions. It has a regulatory function, which was what it started with and still has, and a monetary policy function, which affects the economy as a whole, how much credit there is relative to demand. So that affects interest rates. On the regulatory front, the Fed probably was not as alert as it should have been to the excesses developing in the mortgage market, and maybe with too much leverage, too much borrowing to get things. But I don't think that was unique to the Fed. That was unique to every regulatory agency, because it was the spirit of the times, it was the culture of the times, it was the way society felt at the time. It wanted to have the higher standard of living as fast as you could get it, borrow as cheaply as you could, and just try it right away. Mm-hmm. But the Fed contributed to that by keeping interest rates fairly low after the 2000 stock market crash. They kept interest rates fairly low for an extended period, which made it easy for people to borrow. And so that, in effect, could be said to have contributed to this. In addition, there was a very crucial moment as the crisis evolved, and you could see it coming. And that crucial moment came in late 2008, I think September, where the Fed did not lend money. The Fed was lending money by that time to help out and keep the crisis from getting worse. And then there was a major firm called Lehman Brothers, which is an old, venerable firm, who needed money or they would go belly up. And the Fed refused to lend. Now, lending under this kind of thing, this kind of what we call emergency lending, because if it's loans to someone who isn't a member bank, Lehman Brothers wasn't, of course, it was a securities firm, then that's emergency lending, and that's a big deal. And the Fed decided not to. It had previously made an emergency loan, but with the cooperation of the Treasury. That is, in a sense, the U.S. Treasury contributed a little money too, meaning they approved of this. Well, these kind of emergency loans are really political in a sense, because they're putting at risk the public's money. The Fed's earnings go back to the Treasury, so the Fed's really part of the budget in that sense. And so that gets you into whether it's in the national interest to do such a thing. And that is essentially a political issue. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think. And so on that grounds, the Fed and the Treasury have to be in agreement, I believe. That's my view of it. When the Dodd-Frank Act was passed, the law said clearly the Treasury has to approve these sorts of things. But the law as it existed at the time in September 2008 did not say that. So, but in practice, that's the way it worked out. I think both the Fed and the Treasury decided not to lend to Lehman Brothers, and that intensified the crisis enormously.
You just mentioned Dodd-Frank legislation, and we had an economist tell us recently that it is simply, quote, too big to read, close quote, and will be dismantled by the banking lobby. How effective do you think the Dodd-Frank legislation will be? Well,
first, it is too big for any human being to read. I gave it an effort, I'm sure, and I didn't read it thoroughly throughout, because obviously much of it didn't apply to what I was reading it for. Mm-hmm. But it is large, it is complicated, and it is not clear how it's going to work out because it involves a lot of change, and changes in implementing the changes. You have to work out regulations, and time periods are varied as to when you have to finish it, and those things are in dispute and still in dispute, like the Volcker rule is still in dispute, although it's about to be settled. But that's been 2008 to, 2010 was the Dodd-Frank Act, so it's about 3 years.
Right.
That's in process. So you can't tell exactly how it's going to evolve. My impression, my opinion, is that it is a little bit too complex, and that it is no way of telling if when we get into another crisis whether this is going to whether it's going to help resolve it more easily than we resolved this one that we're in. The hope is that it'll set up things that will prevent such a crisis. But the history of this country and of the world is that we get major financial and other kinds of crises every 20, 30 years, and they're unpredictable, and you don't know what's going to start them because you can't see the future that clearly. But I would say the Dodd-Frank Act has some positive aspects to it, really.
Okay, and I guess time will tell. I mean,
well, we hope it will.
Right. Hopefully it'll tell us in a positive light. Stephen Axilrod, former staff director and secretary of the Federal Open Market Committee of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. He is the author of a new book, The Federal Reserve: What Everyone Needs to Know. Stephen, thank you so much for your time with us today. We look forward to speaking with you again here on americasdemocrats.org.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. President Obama won re-election by putting together a coalition of African Americans, Latinos, women, youth, and progressive whites. But how stable is that coalition? Harvard professor Ryan Enos has studied racial politics in big cities and says Democrats will have their work cut out for them in the future. And that's coming up in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
It's been nearly 50 years since poverty in America was a front-burner issue on our nation's political agenda, and it's time to move it up again. Even as those at the top of our society have grown fabulously richer in the past decade, those in the economic middle have seen incomes stagnate and fall, opportunities decline, and poverty become not about someone else, but about them. Numbers that were not even imaginable half a century ago are now our cold reality. 50 million poor people, 51 million more who are near poor, almost 1 in 4 children under 5 years old living in poverty, and no sign of this mass decline decelerating. The face of American poverty, however, has changed somewhat. In the 60s, the poor had largely been born into it and were out of most people's sight, tucked away in backwater rural counties and isolated urban ghettos. This kind of poverty persists, but today's big jump in numbers comes from families that have been knocked down from a middle-class life, dismayed to find themselves among the long-term unemployed, grabbing at temporary low-paying jobs and buying meager groceries with food stamps. These are the new poor, but they also constitute a new demographic phenomenon, the suburban poor. Once the secure base of the middle class, suburbs have become the fastest-growing home of American poverty. Since 2000, the number of suburban poor has surged by 64%. Twice the rate of urban poor. By 2011, America's suburbs held 3 million more poor people than were in our core cities. This is Jim Hightower saying American poverty is no longer about them, but us. To learn more about it in your area, check out a new Brookings Institution study called Confronting Suburban Poverty in America at www.brookings.edu.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. It's going to be hard for the Obama electoral coalition to stay together in 2014 and 2016, says Harvard political scientist Brian Enos. He's done studies on voting behavior of whites, blacks, and Latinos in some of America's biggest cities. And he says Democrats will have to figure out how to prevent cracks in the coalition. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Ryan Enos is an assistant professor of government at Harvard University. He specializes in political psychology, race and ethnic politics, and political behavior in the United States. He also is affiliated with the Institute for Quantitative Social Science, Center for American Political Studies, and the PhD program in Government and Social Policy. Ryan Enos, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Now, you've done a number of electoral and public opinion studies that seem to show that the more ethnic groups come into contact with each other, the more political differences between them grows, even if they're all Democrats. What kind of threat does that pose to, say, the widely heralded Obama coalition?
It poses a threat in the sense that it's hard to keep these groups together sometimes when a coalition gets big enough and you have groups that may be competing over the same resources or competing over different interests in the same coalition. And we have a lot of historical examples of this. This was classically in the 1960s and the 1950s when, for example, working class whites came into contact with African Americans who were moving up from the South and moving into parts of these northern cities. They started competing for the same jobs. And you saw that in some ways this put a lot of tension on this New Deal coalition that included working class whites and included working class African Americans. And some of those working class whites, of course not all of them, but some of those working class whites moved away from the Democratic Party and started voting more Republican. And you might believe, and we don't know for sure, but you might believe that the Obama coalition could have similar problems, because you see an interesting pattern in American cities now, which is now it's not the working class whites, but for example, you have working class African Americans that are coming into contact with Latinos, and both of them belong to the same coalition, and they're both voting overwhelmingly Democratic now, but it won't necessarily stay that way, and eventually you could see this large coalition that voted so overwhelmingly for Obama and put him in office. You could see it starting to become strained.
You know, there used to be a saying along the lines, and this is a long time ago, that in the South, whites didn't care how close you came to African Americans as long as they didn't get political power. And in the North, whites didn't care how much power an African American had as long as he didn't get too close to you. Do you see that as still being true?
Well, unfortunately, yeah. I mean, there is probably still some truth to that, and that is actually one of the keys to understanding this is that you seem to see that a lot of whites that their reactions to African Americans grow more strongly negative the closer those African Americans get. Now, that's not true for everybody. Of course, we mean this on average, but I think that there is and one caveat to that is in the South, of course, actually that there's just sort of a higher average level of racism, and it doesn't vary as much actually with how close people are to African Americans. And so it shows in some ways, though, that this problem that people in the United States outside the South have thought was sort of peculiar to the South is something that actually can happen to people outside the South as well, that we all have these sort of latent racial attitudes, and they can become stimulated when they come in contact with African Americans. We can see this by actually analyzing voting data. You can see it among whites in a lot of different cities where these whites that are living close to African Americans, yet still sort of starkly segregated. So you have a group that's coming very close and maybe threatening somebody, but not close enough that people can really get to know them and become friends with them. Then you see them voting against people like President Obama. There's actually a very clear pattern there.
Wow, it's amazing. And this isn't necessarily, as you say, relegated to the South. I mean, you've done studies that have shown these attitudes, maybe somewhat surprising to folks in northern, let's say, Massachusetts or in Chicago and that sort of thing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we've done studies in Massachusetts and the Boston area where we show reactions against Latinos among Anglo-whites. We see it in Chicago, a reaction against African Americans among Anglo-whites, but then it even exists among other groups too. So some of the work I've done in the past was in Los Angeles, and this is liberal California. That you see in Los Angeles, you actually see a reaction of Latinos against their proximity to African Americans. So the closer they would get to African Americans, the less likely they were to vote for Obama. And even flipping it on the other side, there's some evidence with some experiments we've done that you can show African Americans will react to the presence of Latinos, where maybe African Americans in some of the traditionally African American communities in the Los Angeles area, places like Compton, places like South Los Angeles, that are seeing an influx of Latino immigrants, that they feel politically threatened by the presence of these immigrants, and that will change their political behavior as well.
We're speaking with Ryan Enos, an assistant professor of government at Harvard University. He specializes in political psychology, race and ethnic politics, and political behavior in the United States. Other groups, speaking of that, does the age of a voter make a difference in his or her decision to abandon their party?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that abandoning a party is not something that happens often. And the reason we say that is your political party is actually one of the most stable things you can have in terms of a person's identity. It's up there with a person's religion, for example, but even more stable. And once a person adopts a party around the time they're maybe in their college years, early 20s, around like that, it's really hard to change. But people that are in that period when they're being what we might call politically socialized, when they're learning about politics and they're maybe more easily influenced for different reasons, their parties can change. Now, they can still change later, and they can change with a pretty high probability. Now, they may change later in life, but they're less likely to. One example I give of this, and this is something I talk to my undergraduate students about, and it always shocks them, is you can look at, for example, you can ask a person whether they're a Republican, and you can ask them whether or not they're Irish, and see how they answer that question. And if they say yes to both those questions, you can then go back and check about 5 years down the line and ask them the same questions. If they said they were Republican and said they were Irish, they're more likely to still claim they were Republican than they were to claim that they were Irish 5 years later. So we see that something like political party is even more stable than something like what nationality a person claims to be.
Wow. That's I find that to be pretty fascinating, too. I never would have thought that one had anything to do with the other necessarily. Can't living or working in proximity to another group actually bring people together, though? I mean, for example, there's been a sudden and dramatic shift in attitudes towards gays as more and more straight people find out their neighbors and coworkers are gay, and they're just as normal as they were the day before they found out.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually a very key point, and this shows you how this is not inevitable, that groups come into contact and they're going to be in conflict with each other, and how there actually are things that as a society we can do, or we can do through public policy, to encourage groups coming into sort of a more peaceful coexistence. And the one key fact about this, actually, about people's contact with gays, is that they're not a segregated group, and it just happens that way because, of course, people don't have control over whether they're gay, and they don't really have control over whether their son or daughter is gay. And one day they just find out that somebody in their household is gay, and that person is living with them, and there was nothing they could do about it. And and they knew that person as a person. They might get to know that person more as a person. They know them as somebody besides just somebody that's from another group. And you can contrast that with sometimes how groups come into groups, and by here I mean like racial groups or ethnic groups come into contact. Often they're people that live very close to each other but have no true social interaction. So they might live on the next block over, and they might never come over into each other's house. They might go to school but never talk to each other, and they live in these highly segregated patterns. And what you see, the sort of key to these racial conflicts, is often when groups live really close to each other but are not actually integrated truly as a group. And that's why sometimes when we think about public policies that can encourage true integration and sort of true equality between groups, so things like school desegregation, which actually, believe it or not, is something we're still working on in this country, 50 years after we first started working on it, and things about integrating people into different parts of the city, things about raising people's income so groups are more integrated and we don't have poor people who are often racial minorities segregated from white people, all those things can help with groups actually integrating and creating more interpersonal contact and actually causing better group relations rather than worse.
I would say that some of your studies show that we've got a lot of work to do, and it's amazing that 50 years later, and it's mind-boggling some of the studies that you've done and some of the results that you've gotten from these studies. Before we let you go, what do your studies mean for Democrats in particular for the 2014 midterm elections and then the 2016 presidential election?
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly, but one thing that it does show is that these coalitions can be hard to hold together. And as Democrats think about the policies they want to implement, they do need to think actively about how these affect their coalition. One example would be, for example, immigration reform. Now, everybody knows that is good public policy. It's just something that has to happen. But at the same time, Democrats do need to be aware that there could be some sort of potential backlash against that. Now, nobody's advocating not doing immigration reform, but they need to think along the lines, for example, of the rhetoric around immigration reform. They need to think about how they're going to keep these different parts of their coalition together in the same party. So if they want to maintain this broad, diverse coalition and look for victory in 2014 and then 2016, that they're very aware of this potential for this coalition sort of crack at its edges.
Okay. Ryan Enos, an assistant professor of government at Harvard University, specializes in political psychology, race and ethnic politics, and political behavior in the United States. Fascinating work, and I'm sorry you got the results that you got, but it's eye-opening and it's something that needs to be dealt with. Thank you very much for your time with us.
Thank you for having me.
And this is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia.
Just talking to Senator Sherrod Brown about NSA, among others. Sherrod Brown joining the comments that made here on the program yesterday by Senator Dick Durbin, the number 2 most powerful Democrat in the Senate, that the NSA program, as it's now being conducted, goes too far, and they limited their collection of data on phone calls made in this country should be limited to those on which they might have reasonable suspicion of some connection with terrorists rather than a blanket collection of everybody's phone calls. There are people, members of the House of Representatives, too, who have expressed some concerns about this. Members of the House Judiciary Committee, including former Chairman John Conyers, Congressman Jerry Nadler from New York, and Congressman Bobby Scott from the 3rd District of Virginia joins us on our news line this morning. Congressman Scott, good to talk to you.
Bill, good to talk to you.
Yeah, I haven't seen you in a while. So you and your colleagues there are calling for hearings on this NSA. What's your beef with what NSA is doing?
Well, one of the things, you've got 2 different questions. One is whether or not the collection of every phone call made in America is information related to an ongoing foreign intelligence investigation without any targeting, just every phone call. I'm not. The former chairman of the committee, Mr. Sensenbrenner, said that when he wrote the bill, that's not what he meant. The other thing is, after you get it, what can you do with it? Because that's really a different standard.
Yeah.
We just had a DNA case in the Supreme Court. They said if you've been charged with sexual assault and they take your DNA and then find out it wasn't you, they have your DNA. They can then take the DNA and run it through the database just to see if you've committed any crime.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they couldn't have gotten the DNA to run it through to see if you've committed a crime, but once they have it, apparently they can use it. Now, once you collect all these phone calls, if it's legal to get it, the FBI has or the NSA, whoever gets it, has it. What can they do with it? Can they curiously go through and see if Bill Press is called an AIDS doctor or a marriage counselor or a bankruptcy attorney or a drug rehab office? Can they check to see who else you've been talking to, like who your sources are?
Yeah.
They've got the information.
Sure.
Can they run criminal investigations with this data that they got for another reason? Now, the way the law is written, it almost invites criminal investigations, and the problem is you're running criminal investigations. You don't need probable cause. Obviously, you don't need probable cause to get all this data.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you've got one of these task forces and one person around the room has access to FISA court, then all of a sudden you can run the criminal investigation without the normal Fourth Amendment protection.
So this basically is authorized. They claim, NSA claims, and the Obama administration claims, it was all authorized under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, correct?
Right.
And you think this is an abuse of Section 215. And so does Sensenbrenner, obviously.
Say again?
So are you going to, I know you're going to be holding hearings on this. Do you plan on introducing any legislation to tailor down or to limit the application of 215 and limit what the NSA can collect?
Well, I think first of all need hearings to ascertain what's going on. Because one of the problems we have is this foreign intelligence is not limited to terrorism, and so you can get the probable cause you need to get this information is probable cause that the person you're targeting is an agent of a foreign government. I mean, you could be talking about trade deals or any kind of foreign diplomacy, and you have the right, just spying, and so getting all this information for terrorism protection is one thing. But then once you've got it, can you use it for everything else? Excellent question.
So, Congressman, here's what I've heard, and I've heard this from friends of mine who are working on this issue, and I've heard it from senators and members of Congress who defend what NSA is doing. And here you've heard it, I'm sure. It's like the talking point is, look, we're looking for a needle in a haystack. But in order to find the needle, you need the haystack. That's how they justify collecting every information on every single phone call made in the United States. What's your answer to that argument?
Well, let's first of all, if you have two different conversations, if you're getting all that information and having it sitting around, and how do you like the idea that the FBI has all of your phone records so they know who you're talking to, including your sources, including any kind of embarrassing information,
right?
Including whether or not you've called a 900 number. It's a pornographic phone number. They've got that information. That's part of the hay. Now, what they use the hay for is usually left out of the conversation.
Yeah,
if
absolutely.
They're only looking for terrorism, that's one conversation. It's for anything else. Criminal investigations, and when you talk about government access to this information, you're talking about some of your neighbors who may work for the NSA or the FBI or local police. Because one of the problems we had going into this was that the FBI wasn't talking to the Department of Defense, wasn't talking to the CIA, and you had the same kind of conversation with the Boston bombing that nobody connected the dots. Everybody didn't know what everybody else knew. Now, how many friends of yours work for the local police department? I mean, do they get to look at your phone records? If it is limited to terrorism investigations, then you're having a different conversation. If you are opening it up once they've got it to any kind of curiosity, how many people can kind of peep at it to see how many political operatives working for the local police department can look up to see who Ken Cuccinelli, the Republican candidate for governor. Let's check out his record. Go snoop. And don't tell anybody where you got it, but if you've got the a lead, maybe you can park somebody out front of the divorce lawyer's office and see why he's been calling.
Yeah. Hey,
you don't have to know why you got the tip.
Congressman Scott, I hate to interrupt. We're just out of time here at the end of the hour. I really want to thank you. I want to thank you for joining us, but also I want to thank you for being a voice on this issue. There are too few voices. People are standing up and saying, wait a minute, let's slow down. The NSA has gone way overboard. Congressman Bobby Scott, Congressman John Conyers, they're way out in front of this issue. We thank you.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Stephen Axilrod, Ryan Enos, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org